Hey guys, tonight we start with a topic that is a little less philosophical and a lot more greasy medieval junk food. Yes, even in a world without hot dog carts or fast food chains, people still found ways to snack, and let me tell you that some of it was delicious and some of it was disturbing. It's always interesting to see who is watching from around the world, so before you settle in, please take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you truly enjoy what I do here. In a world where most treats tasted awful and looked suspicious, let's ease into tonight's voyage together by turning on a fan for that gentle background hum. Apple fritters were a rare treat. Sweet, hot, and slightly dangerous. Like all good medieval decisions, these golden little pucks were the closest thing to a medieval donut, minus the frosting and food safety regulations. So what exactly went into a fritter back then? Not apples, of course, but rather small, tart, knobby bly things that grew behind the alehouse and might have been stolen from a neighbor's tree. They were chopped up and tossed in a rough batter of flour, eggs, and occasionally ale, because ale made everything seem a little happier. A fritter fresh out of the pan was a little piece of joy, crispy edges, soft center, and a slight risk of third-degree burns. Deep frying in the 1300s was a unique kind of drama, with the oil, typically pig fat, being reused until it could probably vote added flavor, which is a generous word with a lot of meaning. If you were wealthy and fortunate, it might be topped with imported sugar, a luxury that served as a social flex for everyone else. In any case, a drizzle of honey or spiced syrup worked well, and it was sweet enough to take your mind off the rest of your diet, which mostly consisted of cabbage masquerading as other foods. When you needed a treat and didn't mind a little grease on your tunic, you would grab a fritter at a fair after church or on market days. Kids loved them, adults loved them, and birds tried to steal them. They were quick, easy, and just decadent enough to make you forget about the pickled turnips that were waiting at home. Sure, sometimes they were overcooked, or the apples were more sour than sweet, or the batter was suspiciously chewy. But when they were good, they were really. Cheese curds were the medieval equivalent of a popcorn snack. And if apple fritters were the medieval equivalent of a donut, then, with just one bite, you could see why people put up with medieval living. They were a little noisy and wildly variable in size, but that's what made them perfect. They weren't showy, they didn't melt, they didn't stretch. In fact, they hardly did anything at all. To be clear, medieval cheese was created quickly, consumed quickly, and meant to last for lengthy travels. That wasn't meant for Instagram fame. Untrustworthy storage and the sporadic walking of goat's cheese curds were essentially baby cheese. The early fresh bits before the wheel hardened into something that could double as a building material. These little clumps of dairy joy were a byproduct of the cheesing process. Farmers would separate milk into curds and whey using rennet, which sounds fancy until you realize it came from the stomach lining of a baby animal. But hey, it worked. The curds were pressed lightly, salted, and then that was it. Cheese curds. Sometimes they were soft, sometimes rubbery, sometimes they squeaked on your teeth like they had a personality, but they were filling, portable, and weirdly satisfying. And in a time where snack usually meant old bread or cold broth, curds felt like a win. Monks loved them, travelers packed them, kids would eat them like candy. Assuming the cows had been cooperative that week, you could fry them, crumble them over stews, or just eat them by the handful while pretending not to smell like the inside of a barn. Unlike many medieval foods, cheese curds didn't require a celebration or feast. They weren't saved for holidays or saints' days. They were just there, comforting, familiar, mildly chewy, the friend who always shows up, never overperforms, but is weirdly reliable when everything else falls apart. Did they sometimes taste A little offshore freshness was a spectrum in the Middle Ages, but with enough salt and enthusiasm, most people didn't complain. Besides, in a world without refrigeration, your standards naturally adjust, so no cheese curds weren't glamorous, but they were simple, hearty, and just indulgent enough to count as a treat. In a pinch, they were also excellent for bribing cats and small children. Turnips are not dessert to start, but in the medieval times, when sugar was costly and apples weren't always in season, someone somewhere thought, what if this were pie? As inventive desperation was a significant food category. Then came the turnip pie, which, to be honest, wasn't always bad at times. It was even kind of tasty. Imagine mashed turnips, presumably soft, combined with a little egg, honey, or dried fruit. The result was surprisingly edible, if the cook was feeling generous. It was baked inside a sturdy crust made of flour, water, and ambition. At its best, it was warm, slightly sweet, and had the vaguely comforting feel of root vegetable meat pudding. At its worst, it tasted like someone had mistaken animal feed for baking ingredients and simply rolled it with it. There were two key reasons why turnip pies were so popular. Turnips were inexpensive, and pie crust could conceal a lot of sins. Whether the turnips were overripe, undercooked, or suspiciously bitter, once you baked them into a pie and drizzled some honey over them, it became peasant food with aspirations. Was it cheesecake? No, but it tried, and in medieval Europe, experimentation was common. You would find these pies at feast tables, at fairs, and in monasteries, with a lot of extra root vegetables and a little too much thyme. Some recipes called for the addition of spices. Nutmeg if the abbey was rich, pepper if the cook was chaotic. Occasionally raisins made an appearance, which only confused people further. Nobles didn't eat turnip pie unless they were slumming it for fun or pretending to relate to the common folk. For political reasons, but for everyone else, it was dessert, sort of more like an afterthought with pastry. And yet, despite its questionable logic, the turnip pie endured. People liked it, or at least they didn't dislike it enough to stop making it. It was cheap filling and mildly sweet, which for medieval food made it basically revolutionary. If the medieval world had a comfort food MVP, it was the meat pasty, a handheld pie stuffed with seasoned meat, tucked into a folded crust, and baked until it was golden brown or slightly scorched, basically a medieval Hot Pocket, minus the microwave, and plus a genuine sense of danger. The beauty of the pasty was its portability. You could eat it on the road, in the fields, or while watching a public execution, whatever the day demanded. Wrapped in a thick pastry crust, it stayed warm for a while, and protected the contents from dirt, rats, and the occasional peasant sneeze. But let's talk about that filling. Meat, in this case, was a flexible term. If you lived near a manor or a hunting estate, you might get pork, mutton, or venison, actual recognizable meat. If not, well, options expanded dramatically. Rabbit, pigeon, eel, hedgehog, anything that once had legs or slithered could be diced, seasoned, and hidden inside pastry with plausible deniability. Spices were often used to enhance flavor or, more realistically, to distract you from it. Pepper, sage, and garlic helped, but they couldn't completely hide the fact that the meat had been resting for a few days longer than it should have, still in a time when refrigeration was a fantasy, and lunch was often just bread and onions. A meaty pasty felt indulgent. There were even vegetarian versions filled with root vegetables, leeks, or cheese for fasting days or the particularly devout. But make no mistake, the meat ones were the crowd pleasers. They were greasy, hot, and comforting. You didn't ask what was inside. You just ate it, and hoped the cook had been in a good mood. And in case you're wondering, yes, people sometimes marked the crust with initials or symbols to claim ownership, especially among miners and laborers in some places. The crust was extra thick along one edge, so it could be held with dirty hands and then tossed to the spirits, or more realistically, to rats. So were they good often? Yes. Were they mysterious? Always. But that was part of the charm. You didn't eat a meat pasty to feel safe, you ate it because it tasted good, and you were ready to accept the consequences. In a world where brushing your teeth meant rinsing with wine and hoping for the best, candied fennel seeds were the closest thing medieval folks had to breathe. Minced tiny, sugary, and vaguely herbal, they were part treat, part digestive aid, and part dental hazard, all wrapped up in a single, oddly satisfying crunch. These little seeds were typically coated in a hard shell of sugar, which was no small feat in the Middle Ages. Sugar had to be imported, boiled, beaten, and poured by hand, meaning someone somewhere really believed in the potential of these tiny snacks. They were especially popular in noble households, where guests might be handed a small dish of them after dinner to freshen the mouth and probably to distract from the mutton still clinging to their murs. Flavor-wise, fennel seeds had a strong licorice-like bite. You either loved them or politely swallowed them whole and nodded in gratitude. The sugar coating helped, but there was always that distinct herbal kick. Is the sort of thing that leaves you feeling both awed and a little perplexed. Candied fennel seeds were also thought to aid in digestion, particularly after a heavy meal that included 3 different kinds of birds and a startling amount of mead. Think of them as the medieval equivalent of chewing gum crossed with Tums, but with a greater chance of chipping a tooth. Yes, they were hard, like crack your mare, but if you're too confident, you didn't chew them carelessly. Instead, you tested one by biting down slowly and listening for cracking sounds, then committed. Each time, it was a risk-reward scenario, and the wealthy would pop them like medieval tic-tacs. Common people occasionally obtained imitations, which typically included honey-crushed herbs and a hazy sense of hope. They weren't quite the same, but they were excellent enough to pass for it in the impressive array of medieval junk food. If medieval desserts had a golden child, it would be the honey cake, which was dense and prone to sticking to everything but your expectations. Candied fennel seeds were tiny but powerful. They didn't fill you up, but they left a pleasant taste in your mouth and gave the impression of refinement, even if you were covered in mud and still had goose grease on your tunic. Assuming that people had access to bees or weren't scared to climb trees and get stung in the face, honeycakes were the result of ambitious bakers when sugar was still kept in a castle treasury. Typically, these cakes were made with flour, water, and generous spoonfuls of honey, or what constituted spoonfuls in a time when spoons were primarily used to ward off siblings. The end product was a firm, chewy slab that, depending on how long it had been sitting near the hearth, could either be a delicious snack or a temporary doorstop. Spices were occasionally added if the household was feeling particularly wealthy or wanted to show off. Nutmeg, cloves, or cinnamon could give the honey cake a little flair, and by flair, we mean the capacity to get the entire village talking about your recipe for a week. Dried fruits were also added if they hadn't been stolen by the local kids or turned into wine. Honey cakes were popular at feasts, festivals, and weddings, mostly because they could be made ahead of time, didn't spoil quickly, and could survive being dropped on the ground, stepped on, or thrown at someone in a mild food fight. They were also used as gifts, bribes, and occasionally passive-aggressive statements here. I made this for you, it's sweet. Unlike your personality, structurally, they weren't what you'd call delicate. Many resembled compact bricks. Slicing them required a sturdy knife, and the quiet hope that no one was watching you struggle eating them was easier. Just don't expect a fluffy bite. These cakes were built for medieval life, tough, durable, and coated in enough sticky honey to make your hands feel like you lost a battle with a beehive, but they were satisfying. They tasted like warmth and indulgence, like the rare moment you weren't chewing salted barley or chasing rats out of your cupboard. They were joy wrapped in sugar with just enough chew to count as cardio. Fried fish skin cracklings, perhaps the most surprisingly delicious food to come out of a civilization that also believed that eel pie was a good idea. No one set out to create this. More likely, some frugal cook was left staring at a stack of discarded fish skins and thought, what if we just fried it? These crispy, salty little strips weren't glamorous, but they were effective waste, not want not. Especially when you're working with a fish that honestly smells like it's judging you. Fish skins were abundant, especially in coastal towns or along rivers where herring, cod, or whatever had been pulled out of the water was processed on site. The meat went to the stew pot, the heads went to the cat, and the skin was thrown into a pan of bubbling oil and sizzled into submission. This result was surprisingly addictive. History was made, or at least something vaguely edible, after a splash of hot fat. A thin, crispy nibble that tasted like concentrated seawater and crunched like a dry leaf. The experience was enhanced by a dash of salt and a hint of herbs or garlic. After a day of carrying firewood or protecting sheep from other people's sheep, soldiers packed these cracklings, which were not only delicious but also useful. Lightweight, non-perishable, and heavy in fat, exactly what a medieval body needed. They were the lifeblood of seafarers. Sometimes they still had scales, certainly, and sometimes they coiled into strange patterns that made you wonder about your life decisions. Peasants sold them outside taverns for a few coins, and the satisfaction of feeding inebriated people something louder than their speech, indeed. But by medieval standards, they were incredibly tasteful, crispy, and exquisite. Their only major flaw was their fragrance, which could be detected from 3 cottages away. When life gave you stale bread and warm beer, you didn't cry. Because you made the most medieval snack imaginable, bread soaked in ale, also known as soups or trench toast. If you fried a batch indoors, your house would smell like Poseidon's laundry for a whole week. But you'd be forgiven because they tasted good. This is how comfort food think French toast works without eggs, sugar, cinnamon, or joy. Yesterday's bread, the kind that could be used as building material, was flat when you dipped it in a bowl of ale. It wasn't a nice craft ale with citrusy flavors and a hoppy finish. The bread absorbed the ale like a sponge with trust issues, softening, swelling, and changing from a jawbreaker into something vaguely edible. The ale was brewed in a smoky back room in someone's home with the hygienic standards of a barn owl. Was it tasty in the right light, with a positive attitude, and with low expectations? Yes, it was quite toasty and bready, with a hint of fermented grain bitterness that didn't overtly irritate the palate. Bread soaked in ale was a quick filling and messy enough snack that it felt like a real break from everyday chores. Sometimes people added extras. This snack was particularly popular among working-class people who didn't have time for multiple courses or cutlery, but still needed calories that wouldn't fight back. On feast days, you might even get soaps soaked in spiced ale, which basically means the cook got inspired after finding a nutmeg shaving somewhere. Like many medieval dishes, this one served 2 purposes. It was food, and a way to stretch ingredients like bread that was too stale to chew. Simply soak the ale until it turns, then pour it on bread, and act like it was an intentional waste meant for amateurs. The bread transformed into a kind of sloshy porridge cube when it was soaked, which was the only drawback. Eat it quickly to avoid having a mushy sponge in your bowl and a 1,000-year-old dish. Metaphor for disappointment, but nothing beats a slice of alley bread mush and a moment of peace on a cold evening by the fire. If you've ever looked at a piece of bread and thought it would be better dipped in alcohol, congratulations. You and the upper class of the Middle Ages share a common trait. SOPs in wine were one of the more sophisticated, strangely particular, snacks of the Middle Ages. Technically, they were deserts, but perhaps they were experiences. The idea was straightforward. Dip bread in wine, not just any wine, of course. Usually mold-sweetened or spiced, wine ideally toasted, or at least not quite stale. When the bread was sufficiently soaked, it was given as a soft, spoonable treat that the aristocracy referred to as exquisite, hardly concealing the fact that it had been sitting in a clay jug since the previous harvest. The others silently pondered whether the cook had just ran out of ideas. This was not finger food. Rather, it was the type of food you ate slowly with a spoon while feigning an interest in lute music. It was served at banquets, late-night feasts, and awkward dinners when no one wanted to discuss politics. When done right, the soaps in wine were warm, comforting, and mildly intoxicating. It was a gentle way to end a heavy meal. The bread added texture, the wine added richness, and the spices made you feel as though you were a part of something fancier than it was. When done poorly, however, it was just wet bread in a bowl, and no amount of cinnamon could mask the sensation that you were chewing a medieval era. Occasionally, cheese, dried fruits, or a whole egg were added for flair, and occasionally, a whole egg. At that point, it ceased to be a snack and became a culinary guessing game, and peasants made their own versions, usually substituting cheap vinegar or ale for wine. It wasn't dessert. Rather, it was breakfast, dinner, or whatever you might call, a meal that left you feeling both satisfied and perplexed. Even though it tasted like sponge soaked in mold, regrettably, soaps and wine had the ability to last because they were warm, filling, and gave medieval people a taste of indulgence. In the Middle Ages, dried fruit was a highly valued treat that was sugary, exotic, and shelf-stable enough to last an entire crusade. However, let's be clear, this wasn't your typical trail mix with adorable, realistic packaging. Medieval dried fruit's only purpose was to provide an optional, strongly chewy texture that was almost guaranteed to cause oral damage. Let's begin with the fundamentals. Your typical suspects, these fruits, which included raisins, figs, dates, and, if you were feeling particularly upscale, imported prunes had been sun-dried, smoked-dried, or, in some cases, simply left on a windowsill until they were no longer considered moist. Instead, they were wrinkled, tough, and frighteningly dense, resembling an edible time capsule from the previous harvest. The concentrated sugars in the dried fruit made these shriveled little treats become medieval candies that were adored by nobility. The drawback of eating them was that it was like fighting your own jaw muscles. Monks hoarded them, and kids treated them like rare culinary treasure. There was no such thing as a quiet snack. Dried fruit had its uses, such as in pies, added to porridge, or chopped up and thrown into honey cakes to give the appearance of variety. Rich people would wrap them in pastry, drizzle them with rosewater, or soak them in wine, as if they were trying to impress a Florence guest. Figs came with seeds that doubled as medieval dental floss, dates that were sticky enough to glue your mers together, and raisins that stuck in your teeth for hours. Obtaining dried fruit was a special occasion. Perhaps a wedding, holiday, or the one day of the year that someone remembered you. You would eat it slowly and respectfully, perhaps while hiding in the barn to avoid having to share storage. Dried fruit didn't spoil easily and was frequently stored in small cloth sacks or clay pots. Yes, it hardened over time, which made it a longer-lasting snack, or possibly a projectile if you were creative and had younger siblings. In other words, dried fruit was sweet, luxurious, and slightly dangerous, and it stuck with you sometimes. For example, when you wake up hungry and want something hearty, fried, or something that might bite back, enter the blood pudding ball. A medieval snack that is so dense, bold, and unapologetically iron-rich that it makes modern sausage rolls appear timid. These savory spheres were created from the noble tradition of using every part of the animal. And if you're not wasting blood, then you gather fresh animal blood, usually pig blood, but really any blood would work in a pinch. You then combine it with oats, onions, and spices. They were best served hot, straight from the skillet, but occasionally they were eaten cold, if your appetite outweighed your fear of congealed fat. Once that morbid porridge reaches just the right amount of grim stickiness, you shape it into balls and fry it in sizzling fat until the outside crisps up, like it has something to prove the result. The result is dark, crispy orbs of protein-packed sustenance with a rich, earthy flavor that is code for you'll taste iron and mystery for the rest of the day. Blood pudding balls weren't fancy, but they were easy to carry, high in calories, and alarmingly filling. If you ate 2, you could skip lunch, and if you ate 4, you were probably a blacksmith or trying to win a dare. These snacks were popular during the colder months because nothing warms the soul like fried coagulation. Of course, not everyone loved the texture, and some people didn't love the idea. But in a world where survival came first and flavor came around the 12th, these meaty little morsels earned their place in the medieval junk food Hall of Fame. Forget about pancakes. In a world where your only breakfast option was thin soup, that is depressing about its existence. Medieval pancakes were tougher, thinner, and cooked in enough lard to make your arteries think of early retirement, but they did the job. They were poured onto a sizzling iron griddle coated in bubbling pig fat without the use of non-stick pans. The pancake was the type that could withstand a horseback ride and still be largely edible when you arrived. Occasionally it was a little burnt, occasionally it was a little raw, and occasionally it was charmingly both flavors, depending on what you had. There was no portion control. You just ladled and hoped for the result. A flat, uneven circle with crispy browned edges and a slightly chewy center. Most of the time, it was just pancake and fat, served hot and devoured, like you just ran from a tax collector. These pancakes were democratic. Everyone ate them. A tablespoon of honey was luxury. A dash of ale offered a lovely tang, and a sprinkle of herbs or onions was expected. Merchants, monks, nobility, and peasants, you could eat them if you piled them with cheese, dipped them in broth, or simply rolled them up and called it a day. The medieval wafer, a thin, crisp, suspiciously light biscuit that straddled the line between desert and dental challenge, was particularly popular during Lent and other fasting days when meat was off limits. Pancakes became a loophole, fried, filling, and somehow humble and indulgent. Plus they made excellent vessels for disguising other ingredients that had no business being in your mouth. While they might not have been beautiful, medieval pancakes had staying power. All you needed was a hot pan and a willing stomach. There were wafers in monks' hands outside of churches at village fairs. And sometimes they would float in your soup like a flat holy crouton. About be clear, we are not referring about chocolate-covered treats. The ingredients for medieval wafers were flour, water, and eggs. If you wanted to be fancy, you could add a little honey or rose water, but most people stuck to the fundamentals. Using a medieval panini press, thin batter was placed over hot metal wafer irons, sandwiched between 2 blazing plates, creating a dish that tasted like crispy paper with intentions and appeared appropriate for a communion service. Depending on the iron mold and the baker's level of fatigue, wafers were frequently shaped with religious symbols, floral patterns, or the hazy imprint of a saint's face. These designs didn't improve the flavor, but they gave you something to look at while chewing thoughtfully and acting like you weren't let down. Wafers were popular because they were portable, quick to make, and best of all, they could be sold in large quantities for a tidy profit. On feast days, vendors would set up outside churches and wave stacks of warm wafers at the faithful as they left Mass, by now sin later. Despite their structural fragility, they broke if you tried to break them cleanly, and cracked if you looked at them incorrectly, and the difficulty of storing and transporting them. Eating them outside was a high-stakes game involving crumbs, wind, and regret. Nevertheless, nobles loved these light, crispy, and somewhat celebratory wafers, because they were the medieval equivalent of treating yourself without totally ruining your digestion or your finances. Even though the name sounds sticky, they were sold by the dozen at street booths, and consumed right away before they broke down into tasty confetti. For everyone else, they arrived heaped with fruit or covered with soft cheese. Think candied, oranges, dates, or ginger, covered in enough sugar to make your teeth tingle and your conscience whisper, "You shouldn't be eating this." This medieval delight was basically fruit that had been boiled until it was submerged in syrup and sealed in a jar like a sweet little hostage. It was not for the average peasant chewing his seventh onion of the week. Rather, it was an elite tier snack, the kind of indulgence served in noble halls or given to you as a gift by the wealthy to say, "I like you but not enough to give you land." Sugar was expensive, and fruits weren't always in season, so it was saved for special occasions like weddings or royal visits, or Wednesday if you were insanely wealthy and out of control. The preparation process was ambitious, starting with boiling the fruit in syrup, honey, or refined sugar. If your spice vendor owed you a favor, you would drain it, let it dry slightly, and then do it again and again, because the first time wasn't enough. You weren't merely preserving fruit. You were waging war on moisture itself. Eventually, the result was a glossy, jewel-toned, chewy, intense, and sweet bite that was probably so potent that it could be used as a weapon in large enough quantities. Make no mistake, some versions were presented in fancy glass jars, soft and syrupy, while others were dry-wrapped in additional sugar and distributed as tiny cubes of medieval hypoglycemia. After banquets, succoot trays were distributed like tasty gold coins, signifying that you had access to sugar trade routes, and that at least one servant was devoted exclusively to stirring objects that didn't want to be stirred, while the commoners observed from the kitchen and might have licked a spoon if no one was looking. The guests took one piece, grinned politely, and instantly regretted not snatching three. Was it worth it? Indeed, it was one of the few medieval snacks that truly tasted like dessert. It was rich, sophisticated, and lavish enough to compensate for the fact that dinner had consisted of boiled food. The ultimate example of medieval junk food is our fried eel. This dish was so oddly popular that it moved from peasant hearths to royal banquets without ever questioning, "Am I really the best option here?" Yes, it was. In medieval Europe, rivers and streams practically writhed with eels, which were easy to catch, inexpensive to cook, and, when fried, surprisingly crispy, slippery when raw, bonnier than expected, and shaped like the antagonist in a horror story with a fish theme. More importantly though, it wasn't turnips. To prepare it, you would first have to catch the eels, usually at night, as they slithered through shallow waters like sentient noodles. Then, they had to be skinned, which was a tedious process that was more like wrestling a wet rope that didn't want to die. Once subdued, the eels were chopped, seasoned if you were feeling adventurous, and tossed into hot fat until the skin crisped up and the meat firmed into something vaguely appealing. The finished product would be a crunchy, savory bite with a rich, slightly oily flavor, as if Calamoran chicken had an identity crisis in a tavern kitchen. Fried eel was offered in roadside eateries, fairs, and, shockingly, during religious fasts. Since eel wasn't actually meat, it was able to get past the dietary restrictions just like itself. Nobility showed it off. Monks ate it. Like the which always wanted to make sure it had bones. Lots of them kings had it packed into pies and paraded across banquets. Yes, it periodically wriggled long after it had died. But if you could get over that and the unsettling sensation that you were eating a villain from a cautionary folk tale, fried eel was a delicacy, a slippery little miracle that kept bellies full and menus strange in the ancient world. It was genuinely delicious, with crispy skin, tender inside, and just enough greasy to make you feel like you were living a little too dangerously for a Wednesday afternoon today. Nowhere was Mesopotamia more at the intersection of myth and mystery than in the way the Sumerian Akkadians perceived dreams. By about 2500 BCE, the Mesopotamians had developed a full-fledged system of dream interpretation, recorded on clay tablets in cuneiform script. These weren't bedtime novelties. They were used in statecraft medicine and religious rituals. For the Assyrians and Babylonians, a dream wasn't just a private, meaningless experience. Rather, it was a divine telegram, a supernatural email sent directly from the gods to the subconscious. Ignoring it would be like leaving a message from Enlil, unread and dangerous. If a disturbing dream portended unpleasant things, kings would postpone hostilities. If farmers saw a goat soar across the sky while they were asleep, they wouldn't sow crops because they thought the world was always talking and you had to listen with your eyes closed. The ancient counterpart of Freudian psychologists, but without the couch, were professional dream interpreters, known as Baru priests, who received their training at omen libraries. Books, such as the Ishkarzak, a comprehensive dream guide that classified dreams and their meanings in ways that were uncanny yet eerily accurate. Eating dates in your dream is a positive sign. Dreaming of losing your teeth or anticipating a death in the family, congrats if you're fantasizing of having sex with a goddess. Either you're blessed by God, or you're plagued with conceit. These dream books portrayed cause and effect as though dreams were mathematics where an equals b, rather than claiming to be able to discern interpretations. Watch a snake anticipate. Treachery drop from a rooftop. A lawsuit is on the horizon. The Mesopotamians performed dream incubation in addition to dream interpretation, which was reasonable because the world of dreams operated on divine logic, which was very different from human reason. In some situations, a monarch who desired divine guidance may sleep at a temple. Rituals for purification during fasting, maybe make some incense offerings and watch for a dream that will reveal the truth. For Mesopotamians, the dream world was not a mystery to be solved. Rather, it was a realm to be navigated with caution, reverence, and a very large clay tablet library. They believed that the gods were always speaking, and you only had to be asleep to hear them. The idea was that certain environments made the divine connections stronger, clearer, and less prone to nightmares about drunk goats. In ancient Egypt, dreams were regarded as sacred scriptures in motion rather than just nocturnal events. Every dream, whether good or bad, had a purpose. It could warn, bless, instruct, or terrify. By the time of the New Kingdom, around 1550 to 1070 BCE, the Egyptians had started writing down their interpretations in what would become some of the earliest dream manuals in history. They believed that dreams were messages from the gods' ancestors, or even from one's own K, the spiritual double of a person. The Ramesseid Dream Book, which was written on papyrus and found in the village of Deir el-Medina, is one of the most well-known examples. It was not a light reading. Rather, it was essentially a divine diagnostic tool that listed hundreds of dreams and interpreted each one based on whether the outcome would be favorable or disastrous. The logic was not always intuitive though. For instance, if a man saw himself eating crocodile flesh in a dream, it meant he would become a high official. This is a strange omen, but in Egyptian cosmology, the crocodile was associated with the god Sobek, who represented strength and power. The first line of each dream book entry was "if a man sees himself," which was followed by a symbolic situation. The interpretations were frequently binary, marked as good or bad in red and black ink, and were derived from millennia of ceremonial knowledge, personal visions, and temple history, rather than being arbitrary guesses. The idea was to open a divine channel through purification, prayer, and controlled sleep. This wasn't just superstition. It was healthcare, divination, and theology rolled into one night's rest. If your dream was deemed bad, it was time to light some incense and ask a priest to step in. Priests in temple complexes, especially those serving healing deities like Serket or Thoth, occasionally offered services in dream incubation where supplicants would sleep in the temple and await guidance or healing through visions. Amulets may be used to prevent recurrent nightmares. The sleeping mind was not idle. It was a stage where gods, demons, and the spirits of the dead could appear and offer glimpses into hidden truths if you had the wisdom and a priest to decode them. In the ancient Greek world, dreams were more than just divine whispers. They were clinical appointments with the gods. Certain rituals could be performed to erase a dream, much like you would erase a curse for the ancient Egyptians. The practice of incubation, which involved sleeping inside a temple in the hopes of receiving a healing vision, was central to this belief. No deity was more closely associated with this practice than Asclepius, the god of medicine. At temples known as Pyrrha, which were scattered throughout the Greek world from Epidaurus to Pergamene, the sick, the hopeful, and the desperate came seeking cures, but instead of pills or potions, they were prescribed sleep sacred, which was intentional, and performed under specific spiritual conditions before entering the temple's sleeping quarters or abaton, in which a person would undergo purification, bathing, fasting, and occasionally offering an animal sacrifice. Only then could they lie down on a stone bed and wait for the god to appear in a dream, according to inscriptions and ancient testimonies. Whether these dreams were genuine psychosomatic or placebo-driven, the impact was significant. Some patients would awaken healed, or at least think they had received divine instructions on what to do next when they dreamed of Asclepius touching them with his staff, or of snakes, his sacred animal, slithering over their bodies. Greek doctors, such as Hippocrates, recognized the importance of dreams in diagnosis and did not reject them as absurd. Rather, they thought that the body might communicate its condition through symbolic visions. A dream in which water flows could indicate kidney problems. In hypocritical literature, a dream of being crushed could indicate a chest condition. Dreams were frequently divided into two categories: natural and divine. Natural dreams were brought on by diet, digestion, or emotional stress, while divine dreams were a whole other category that included direct messages from the gods or the universe. However, not all dream interpreters carried scrolls and wore white robes. The true stars of the public square were the Wanakriti, or dream readers, who used dream guides, omens, and a vast amount of interpretative flair to turn dreams into warnings, blessings, or directions. Throughout the ancient world, one type of dream carried more weight than all others. The most well-known of these guides was the Onerosytica, written by Artemidorus of Deldus in the 2nd century CE. The book was still studied in Greece centuries later. The dream wasn't just a nighttime experience. It was a bridge between mortal and divine body and soul, illness and healing. And if you were lucky, you'd wake up with a cure, and perhaps a snake curled at your feet. For cultures throughout Mesopotamia, Egypt, Greece, and beyond, prophetic dreams were more than just messages. They were warnings, revelations, or calls to action. In the ancient Hebrew tradition, prophetic dreams were revered and acknowledged as a channel of divine communication. They were also considered sacred transmissions from a higher plane that provided direct connections to the fate of God or the enigmatic workings of the universe. There are numerous examples in the Old Testament. Consider Joseph, the son of Jacob, who had a dream in which he saw a sheaf of wheat bending before his own emblem. As an interpreter of the Pharaoh's dreams in Egypt, he foresaw 7 years of prosperity followed by 7 years of famine. One dream about fat and thin cows changed the trajectory of Egypt's economy and foreshadowed his eventual ascent to power. Similar to how monarchs in Mesopotamia frequently received dreams that predicted victory, calamity, or heavenly favor, Joseph did more than merely read dreams. He became a national strategist by doing so. According to Ashurbanipal, the Assyrian monarch, he had dreams in which the gods led him to victory in battle and government. In a civilization where the distinction between king and divinity was blurred, prophetic dreams were viewed as proof that a monarch possessed divine legitimacy. The Greeks also understood the prophetic potential of dreams, classifying those that came from the subconscious as anhypnia, and those that revealed reality as oniroi alithonoi. Prior to making important decisions like creating a city, declaring war, or setting out on a voyage, these were not taken lightly. Greek leaders frequently sought advice from dream interpreters. Dreams were so sacred that they had their own little gods, winged spirits that came into the sleeper's head with divine messages. In ancient societies, prophetic dreams were not incidental. Rather, they were tools of power, instruments of policy, and evidence of divine selection. The fate of nations, the health of empires, and the rise of legends frequently began with something as simple as a whispered vision in the dark. Even the more pragmatic Romans, such as the Emperor Augustus, were said to have dreamed of future glory, and even Nero sought the advice of dream interpreters during his reign, though perhaps not enough, given how that turned out. The most intriguing example comes from the cult of Men, a Phrygian lunar god linked to healing cycles and naturally occurring dreams. His temples frequently sat on hills facing the night sky, as if positioned to catch lunar messages beamed down into the dreams of supplicants. Incubation was not limited to Greece. In Anatolia, modern-day Turkey, dream healing flourished in a rich blend of Hittite, Phrygian, and later Greco-Roman traditions, with temples and sacred sites dedicated to facilitating contact with divine forces through sleep. The process was similar to what we saw in Asclepian practices, but Anatolian incubation had its own twists. People with physical ailments, spiritual unrest, or uncertainty about their futures would come to these shrines to practice incubation, ritual sleep, in the hopes of receiving a curative or guiding dream. Worshippers occasionally slept beneath celestial engravings or strolled along winding roads, thinking that being close to holy geometry would concentrate divine messages. Chant, music, and incense were frequently employed to help the sleeper's thoughts align with the divine frequency. This slumber served as a spiritual reception rather than a place to rest. Additionally, dream priests, spiritual experts educated to lead and interpret these visions, are mentioned in regional traditions. In order to influence the encounter, some people would even plant dreams that suggested imagery or symbols before going to sleep. For instance, if someone wanted a vision of their future child, they might sleep with a carved fertility idol beneath their pillow. If they dreamed of a lion, the priest might say that a courageous son was on the way. If they dreamed of rain, They might say that a daughter would be blessed with wisdom and growth. In their sleep, kings and queens received strategic advice, healing knowledge, and sometimes harsh warnings from the gods. One dream reportedly told a queen to adopt a foreign goddess into her shrine, which is an early example of divine diplomacy. Hittite records also mention divine encounters in dreams, particularly among royalty. By the 2nd century CE, the ancient art of dream interpretation had developed into a disciplined craft, and one man took it upon himself to systematize it all. Dream incubation in Anatolia was not just personal, it was communal, and cosmic pilgrims traveled great distances, frequently creating temporary healing communities, bound not by blood, but by shared vulnerability and hope. They believed that the gods could reset the course of their lives through sleep, and dreaming wasn't passive. Rather, it was an act of ritual participation, where healing and prophecy flowed not from logic, but from the silent language of sleep. A Greek from Asia Minor, named Artemidorus of Doldus, unlike mystical scribes, who shrouded everything in divine mystery. Artemidorus wrote the Onera Cretica, the most extensive and significant dream textbook of antiquity. The Oneritica was a 5-book tome, written in clear Greek that contained thousands of dream scenarios and their meanings gleaned from public performances, temple records, and personal interviews. Artemidorus approached dreams with the methodical precision of a scholar and the curiosity of a streetwise psychologist. According to Artemidorus, he spent decades gathering dream reports from individuals from a variety of backgrounds, including merchants, sailors, prostitutes, soldiers, and prostitutes. He categorized dreams into categories such as acts, animals, occupations, bodily functions, and even forms of relationships, because he believed that if you want to understand a culture, you need listen to its dreams. Flying in a dream that could imply freedom or conceit, depending on your social standing. Dreaming of being nude in public could represent future power or disgrace. The fact that Artemidorus placed emphasis on context, as opposed to previous dream books that provided static meanings, sets him apart from other dream books. Dreaming of teeth falling out signified the death of a relative, usually one that has persisted over ages. Artemidorus emphasized how crucial the dreamer's rank, gender, occupation, and present situation in life are. When a rich guy dreamed of a shipwreck, it signified trouble for his business. If a poor man had the same dream, he might become wealthy. Interpretation was customized, much like early psychotherapy, rather than being one. Artemidorus also directly addressed symbolism, realizing that dreams employed sarcasm and metaphor. A dying dream could represent rebirth rather than death. Dreams of sex did not necessarily indicate desire. They may also represent shame or power struggles for supremacy. His interpretations straddle the boundary between being utterly odd and profoundly rational. With Artemidorus, the dream became a text to be studied and decoded, not only for prophecy, but also for insight. He may not have thought that dreams came from gods, but he definitely thought that they came from a deep, strange place that was worth exploring. The Oneritica was not just a curiosity, it was used for centuries throughout the Roman Empire and the Byzantine world, influencing medieval dream interpreters and being translated into Arabic to keep the flame alive long after classical temples fell. In the ancient world, not all dreams were divine gifts. Others were terrifying, eerie visions said to originate from demonic powers, restless spirits, or even the abyss itself. These were interpreted as warnings, punishments, or omens of things to come, rather than just restless nights. One of the earliest groups to distinguish between dreams originating from divine and those originating from evil spirits were the Babylonians. A priest would be called to perform apotropilic rituals, cleansing spells, offerings, or symbolic actions to neutralize the effect of a dream that caused fear, illness, or distress. For instance, if someone dreamed of being chased by a demon, the interpreter might advise sleeping with a protective amulet under the pillow or burning cedarwood incense to ward off evil spirits. Additionally, the Egyptians had a sophisticated concept for preventing nightmares. Images of bees, the dwarf deity who guarded homes from evil forces, or dead amulets with Horus eye were worn to ward off these attacks, which were thought to be the source of some dreams. In Greek thought, nightmares frequently represented a message from chthonic deities, not the Olympians, but the gods of the earth and the underworld, Persephone, and even the terrifying Erinfuris. Dreamers who disregarded these warnings did so at their own peril. The philosopher Plato in the Republic even described the dream as a battleground between reason and appetite where the lower parts of the soul ran wild. For him, the nightmare was not just a spiritual warning, but also a psychological one, a sign that your inner self was out of balance. Some people even recited spells to erase nightmares when they woke up, treating them as contagious curses that had to be spoken out of existence before they could manifest in the physical world. In the ancient world, nightmares were more than just bad dreams. They were regarded as cosmic red flags, reminders that the seen and unseen worlds were always connected, and that even in sleep there was no true escape from fate. The Romans, pragmatic as ever, feared dreams of certain animals, such as owls, snakes, or wolves, as signs of impending death, betrayal, or war. They believed the dead could visit the living through dreams, sometimes to warn, sometimes to accuse. When the gods talked in sleep, individuals in positions of authority were ready to claim, "They spoke to me." Rulers, priests, generals, and prophets frequently used dreams as a weapon to defend decisions, change public opinion, or solidify authority. Before he conquered Egypt, for example, Alexander the Great is said to have dreamed that the god Ammon would welcome him as a son. When he arrived at the Sewa oasis, the local oracle verified the dream, stating that Alexander was a divine offspring. Whether the dream was staged or real, it made no difference. The message cemented his rule and made him appear to his soldiers and subjects as more than mortal and a living god. In ancient Rome, Augustus claimed to have dreamed of a great victory at Actium, which he won against Mark Antony and Cleopatra. This dream was later immortalized in literature and coins, turning it into a sacred narrative. Later, emperors followed suit. If the gods supported your dream, who dared oppose your actions? Dreams were particularly helpful during political transitions or uncertain times, when it suited the interests of a ruler or temple elite, such as in the case of a rebellious governor who dreamed of doom. Priests and oracles frequently played into this dream interpretation, turning it into a theological instrument. However, if properly interpreted, dreams of success and prosperity may inspire leaders to launch campaigns, increase taxes, or implement reforms. The priest might see it as divine retribution for opposing imperial power. This was not just for men. The queen, according to Hatshepsut of Egypt's temple inscriptions, the god Amuno appeared to her mother in a dream and foretold her birth. By portraying her reign as predestined, she bolstered her legitimacy in a male-dominated throne. Prophets in the Hebrew Bible also used dreams to challenge kings. For example, Daniel deciphered Nebuchadnezzar's vision of a massive statue that foretold the emergence and collapse of civilizations. Dreams enabled leaders to declare, "This is not just my will, it is the will of heaven." Dream reading was only one aspect of geopolitics, which was encased in allegory in every society. Even though the ancient temples have fallen, and the priests of dreams are now sleeping under layers of dust, the legacy of ancient dream interpretation endures. whispering through time. Whether it was through divine revelation or deliberate propaganda, dreams that turned the subconscious into statecraft one vision at a time. A large portion of what we currently believe about dreams comes from science and psychology. Our interest in recurrent themes of symbolism, the medieval world carried on the old frameworks that attempted to explain the sleeping mind, which is where even nightmares have their origins. In the 19th and 20th centuries, we meet Sigmund Freud, who, despite rejecting religious interpretations, heavily borrowed from the symbolic structure pioneered millennia earlier in the interpretation of dreams. Freud claimed that dreams expressed repressed desires and fears, but he still used ancient tools. In the meantime, Christian monks and theologians began cataloging dreams of saints and martyrs that frequently predicted future miracles or divine justice. This structure remained sleep as a portal to the sacred dreams as veiled messages, and interpreters as the bridge between human and divine, while Islamic scholars refined and expanded Islamic mysticism, metaphor, symbol, and story. His protege Carl Jung continued by stating that the dream world is filled with archetypes and universal figures such as the shadow, the hero, and the wise old man who eerily resemble figures found in a Babylonian omen list or a Greek temple. Even modern neuroscience, while depriving dreams of their mystique, respects their complexity by lucid dreaming, REM sleep, and the impact of trauma or memory on dream content. These theories reaffirm the ancient belief that dreams reveal the condition of the soul as well as the body. Pop culture also continues this tradition, carrying it forward from literature and film to tarot and New Age spirituality. Whether it's a dream journal app or a horror movie about sleep paralysis, dreams continue to captivate people, promising self-awareness despite the lack of brain scans and sleep labs. The ancients understood something that we still pursue today. Dreams are not random. Rather, they are stories, signals, or shadows whispered in the language of gods, ancestors, or ourselves. The question is the same throughout time. What is your dream trying to tell you? In the middle of the 9th century, the United States was a nation that was falling apart by 1860. A letter from New York to San Francisco could take 3 to 4 weeks, sometimes longer if storms delayed it. California had been a state for 10 years, but it frequently felt more like a distant cousin than a sibling. The eastern half of the country was bustling with cities, telegraphs, and railroads, while the western frontier remained rugged, remote, and agonizingly disconnected. Or, if it made it to all mail routes at the time, they were as complicated as they were ineffective, and robbers got in the way. In contrast to the overland route via stagecoach, which was slow and dangerous and frequently hampered by muddy trails, snowbound passes, attacks from outlaws, and hostile terrain. The most popular route involved ships transporting mail down the Atlantic across the Panamanian Islands and back up the Pacific coast. This journey was full of delays, tropical diseases, and logistical nightmares. In an era when secession was already imminent, the federal government was concerned that California's growing isolation might cause it to lose its spirit of loyalty. This lag wasn't just an inconvenience. It was a political issue. To keep the continent united wasn't just ideal, it was urgent. So visionaries and entrepreneurs started to propose audacious solutions. There was nothing more audacious than the notion of establishing a central relay system with the one resource the American West possessed in large quantities: open terrain and swift horses. If experienced riders could alternate horses at stations every 10 to 15 meters, they could possibly reduce delivery times from weeks to just 10 days. Nearly 2,000 meters would separate St. Joseph, Missouri, and Sacramento, California. It would across mountains, deserts, rivers, and territories that had barely been mapped, there would be extreme heat, freezing nights, and the ever-present danger of ambush, but if it worked, it would be the fastest communication line between East and West. The problem was clear: America was expanding faster than its infrastructure, and so with a mix of desperation, ambition, and pure frontier daring, a solution galloped into history, one saddlebag at a time. The Pony Express was about to be born. The Pony Express didn't just materialize out of the dust, it was the brainchild of three ambitious businessmen from the freight and stagecoach firm Russell, Major, and Weddell, based in Missouri. The trio, William H. Russell, Alexander Major, and William B. were already veterans in the overland shipping world. Their company was responsible for hauling freight and government supplies across the wild frontier, but in 1860, they set their sights on a far more radical goal: speeding up mail delivery to California in the shortest time possible. At the time, Russell in particular was feeling the pressure. His reputation was on the line due to financial scandals and failed ventures. He saw the Pony Express not just as a patriotic service, but as a personal redemption arc, a way to restore his name and gain favor with the government. If they could prove their relay system worked, they hoped to land a lucrative federal mail contract. Alexander, the quietest of the three, William B. Weddell, provided the legal and financial backbone. Russell was the salesman, and Major was the operational genius. Major brought the logistics brain, a devoted and meticulous planner, and he demanded discipline from his employees, even requiring riders and station masters to swear oaths against drinking and cursing. He also developed a highly structured system for the express stations, which would be built every 10 to 15 meters, with larger home stations spaced every 7 to 100 miles. Weddell kept the books and ensured the company stayed afloat at least for a while together. The three poured hundreds of thousands of dollars into the venture. They bought over 400 horses, hired more than 80 riders, and built roughly 190 stations across the most remote parts of the frontier. They knew it was a gamble, and they knew the route would be grueling, but they also knew that whoever solved the communication crisis would earn a permanent place in American history. And so, without any government funding, they launched the service themselves. It was a bold move, financially reckless, logistically insane, and yet deeply symbolic of American grit. In April of 1860, the Pony Express was ready to ride the race against time, and terrain was on. Creating the Pony Express route was like building a fragile bridge across a continent with no safety net and almost no margin for error. The full distance spanned nearly 0 meters, stretching from St. Joseph, Missouri to Sacramento, California. Through a dizzying array of landscapes, rolling plains, mountain ranges, high deserts, and dangerous river crossings. To make this insane idea work, the founders built a chain of approximately 190 relay stations spaced every 10 to 15 miles, about the distance a horse could ride at full speed. Before tiring every 75 to 100 meters, a home station provided rest and shelter for the riders, where they could sleep, eat, and hand off the mail to a fresh rider. But the real backbone of the express was the horses, more than 400 in all. They were chosen not for looks or stature, but for sheer speed and stamina. In the East, fleeter-footed thoroughbreds ruled the prairie. In the rugged West, compact and hardy Mustangs carried the mail across the mountains and desert. These were the Ferraris of the frontier. Riders would gallop at full speed, jump off mid-stride, and leap onto a fresh mount in a matter of seconds. Each station had to be manned, stocked, and secure. Some were little more than sod huts or wooden shacks, others were fortified structures, surrounded by barbed fencing, and guarded by station keepers. With rifles, supplies, water feed, and food had to be transported in advance. This meant months of preparation, and it all had to be done in some of the most remote, inhospitable land in America. Weather posed one of the biggest threats. Riders would endure snowstorms in the Sierra Nevada, sandstorms in the Utah desert, and brutal summer heat. On the Nebraska plains, wild animals, swollen rivers, and collapsing trails were daily hazards, and then there were human dangers. Bandits, outlaws, and the rising tensions of conflict with Native American tribes, but despite the chaos, the system worked. With riders swapping every 75-100 miles, and fresh horses every 10-15. The mail flew across the continent in as little as 10 days, a revolutionary speed at the time. It was a logistical miracle stitched together by courage, sweat, and raw determination. In a land where miles meant isolation, the Pony Express stitched together a fragile thread of connection, one hoofbeat at a time. On April 3, 1860, the Pony Express made its historic debut in St. Joseph, Missouri. A crowd gathered at the stables of the Pikes Peak Stables building, buzzing with excitement. The inaugural rider, most likely Johnny Fry, though records are somewhat disputed, mounted his horse, took the leather mock, a specially designed mail pouch, and dashed off westward at breakneck speed. The crowd cheered, cannons fired, and, just like that, a new chapter in American history thundered to life. The mailbag Fry carried weighed around 20 pounds, filled with letters, newspapers, and telegrams. Bound for California, a telegraph message had already been wired from Washington, D.C., and would now travel the rest of the way on horseback, symbolizing the union of technology and raw human effort. At the same moment, a counterpart in Sacramento rode eastward, launching the directional relay. Between them stood nearly 0 meters of wilderness, 190 stations, and some of the harshest terrain North America had to offer, and they planned to cross it in just 10 days each. Rider on the route carried the Mosilla from one station to the next, leaping off a Lethiad horse and onto a fresh one in under 2 minutes. The Mosilla was ingeniously designed. It had 4 locked pouches, and could be quickly slipped over the saddle. Horn, without unstrapping anything. Speed was everything. Riders were expected to maintain a pace of 10 miles per hour, even in the dead of night, through rain, snow, or hostile territory. Despite the chaos, the first ride succeeded. The mail from Missouri reached Sacramento in 9 days and 23 hours. A triumph. Newspapers hailed it as a miracle of modern communication. And the legend of the Pony Express was born almost overnight. Though only a few letters rode in that first mock, the symbolic impact was immense. It wasn't just about getting mail from point A to B, it was about possibility, about proving that this wild, fractured continent could be connected, that man and horse could outpace isolation for the riders. It was the beginning of a dangerous, thrilling chapter for the nation. It was a taste of something new, instant communication, faster than anyone thought possible. The West had just gotten a little smaller. The lifeblood of the Pony Express wasn't the horses, the stations, or even the mochila. It was the riders, a band of young, wiry daredevils who defied weather, wilderness, and war to deliver the mail. They weren't just couriers, they were living legends in the making. The typical Pony Express rider was no older than 18, often closer to 16. They were light, usually under 125 pounds, so as not to weigh down the horses. Speed and endurance were everything. The now famous recruitment ads allegedly read, "Wanted young, skinny, wiry fellows, not over 18, must be expert riders, willing to risk death, daily orphans preferred." Although the wording is probably apocryphal, the spirit behind it was real. These young men rode 75 to 100 miles per shift, changing horses at each station, but never stopping until they had passed the mohila to the next rider. They frequently rode at night through intense heat, snowstorms, or torrential rain. They carried rifles and revolvers, but their best defense against hostile attacks or bandits was speed. Many of them traveled alone without weapons, depending solely on their ability to avoid trouble. Some riders became folk heroes to transport letters during a bloody Pute revolt. Bob Haslam once rode 380 meters in less than 2 days, even though he was wounded by arrows. The Buffalo Bill Cody, who would later become a Wild West showman, claimed to have ridden for the Express at age 15, though historians debate the accuracy of that tale. Regardless, the reality was already dramatic enough. Riders had to navigate the Rocky Mountains, cross the Great Basin, desert and brave territories where the slightest mistake could mean freezing, drowning, or vanishing without a trace. And yet, the service maintained an astonishing reliability rate. Even in the harshest conditions, only one mule was ever lost, despite the danger. Many riders loved the job. They were paid well for the time. $100 to $150 per month, a small fortune for a teenager, and they relished the thrill, the speed, and the sense of purpose. They weren't just riding mail, they were stitching the country together. The riders of the Pony Express were more than messengers, they were symbols of American courage, endurance, and tenacity, galloping through myth and memory with every hoofbeat, and for 18 unforgettable months. They proved that no frontier was too wide to cross. Riding for the Pony Express wasn't just a job, it was a daily gamble with death. The riders faced a gauntlet of perils that would have made most grown men turn back, and yet these mostly teenage boys pressed forward through nature's wrath, armed enemies, and a land that often seemed determined to swallow them whole. One of the most persistent threats came from the environment itself. Riders braved blizzards in the Sierra Nevada, blistering heat across the Nevada desert, and sudden thunderstorms that could flood river crossings or turn dirt paths into impossible muck. Slipping off a horse in freezing conditions could mean hypothermia. Many came dangerously near, and one mistake in a swollen river could result in drowning. Then there were the animals. Mountain lions prowled the high passes, packs of wolves occasionally pursued riders at night, and rattlesnakes coiled in trailside brush. However, even more dangerous than wildlife were bandits and bushwhackers, who knew that a rider's mochila contained valuable letters, some even laced with money orders or gold dust. Although the riders had revolvers, they were outnumbered, and stopping them would have meant risking their lives and missions. The Port War in 1860, which was sparked by grievances over land-broken promises and settler encroachment, also resulted in tensions with Native American tribes. This led to multiple attacks on Pony Express stations, where riders were ambushed, station keepers were killed, and multiple stations were burned to the ground. The most famous of these incidents was when Pony Bob Haslam galloped nearly 190 meters through hostile territory to carry the mail. Who was wounded by arrows, but he completed his route, despite the danger of isolation. Riders were alone, often for hours, with nothing but their horse, their weapon, and the looming dark. A broken leg, an injured horse, or a missed station could mean dying alone in the wilderness, never found, and yet they rode despite all this. The system endured. Mail was delayed, but rarely lost. Riders were occasionally wounded, but they almost always made it through. In 18 months of operation, only a handful of men were killed on the job. The Pony Express wasn't a fantasy of the Wild West, it was a brutal, often terrifying reality. But in surviving these dangers, the riders became legends, proving that even the most unforgiving terrain could be tamed if only for long enough to deliver the mail. Though the Pony Express only operated for 18 months, its impact on the United States was swift, ferryacking, and undeniably profound. In a country teetering on the edge of civil war and desperate to feel unified across its vast landscape, the Express proved one thing: loud and clear distance was no longer destiny. Before the Pony Express, it took weeks for letters to travel from the East Coast to California. Important political decisions. Businesses became more ambitious. Newspapers reported near real-time updates from across the country. Families felt closer, and most importantly, the Union felt more connected, all of which would become crucial as the Civil War loomed politically. The Express also reassured the federal government that the West was within reach. symbolizing national strength and cohesion at a time when fragmentation felt dangerously close. Commercial deals and personal news often arrived too late to matter. The Express financially contributed to the establishment of transcontinental infrastructure by providing President James Buchanan with frequent updates from California during the tense months preceding Lincoln's election. The stations established across remote territory later served as the locations for railroads, telegraph lines, and stagecoach routes. More permanent communication infrastructure would eventually incorporate many Pony Express routes. What was once a bold gamble became the blueprint for how America would connect itself coast to coast. And culturally, the Pony Express became the embodiment of frontier spirit. Newspapers romanticized the riders. Creating instant heroes, young men across the country dreamed of taking the reins. Galloping through danger with a saddlebag full of destiny, the Express became mythologized even as it operated, capturing the imagination of a country hungry for symbols of courage and unity. Even after it ended, the Pony Express continued to shape American identity. It represented speed, courage, sacrifice, and above all possibility. In just over a year it managed to do what steamship Congress and diplomacy had failed to do: make a fractured, sprawling nation feel like one. The Pony Express didn't just deliver mail, it delivered the future one gallop at a time. For all its daring and triumph, the Pony Express was doomed from the start. It wasn't a matter of failure. It was a matter of technology. As fast as a horse could ride, nothing could compete with the speed of a wire construction on the transcontinental telegraph. A coast-to-coast communication line that would send messages in minutes rather than days. Started barely 2 days after the Pony Express was formally introduced in April 1860. By October 24, 1861, just 18 months after the first ride, the last telegraph wire was strewn across the nation. The system went live, and the connection was instantaneous. That same day, the Pony Express carried its last letter. The rhythmic click of Morse code replaced the silence of hoofbeats. However, even before the telegraph, the Pony Express was losing money despite its legendary performance. The telegraph poles and lines moved steadily westward from the Missouri River and eastward from California. It was a business catastrophe. With no federal subsidies and hefty operating costs, Russell, Major and Weddell had invested over $700,000 in the venture and had hardly recovered a portion of it. Maintenance of horse riders, stations, and logistics of supplies originally constructed as a proof of concept for a mail contract that never materialized, the Express was never a viable business model. Russell himself was embroiled in a financial scandal, and the company started to fail. By the time the telegraph was finished, the Express was already on its last legs. Heroic, adored, and totally out of date, but the conclusion was met with little resentment because the Pony Express had succeeded in demonstrating that quick coast-to-coast communication was feasible. Although the Pony Express only lasted 18 months, it left hoofprints that no telegraph wire could ever erase, turning into one of the most enduring and romanticized stories in the country's history. In reality, it was a risky, short-lived business venture, but in the public's imagination, it became something far greater, a symbol of heroism. Riders turned to other frontier jobs, stations were repurposed or abandoned, and the nation looked to the future. The Pony Express's demise was not a failure. Rather, it was a passing of the torch. The horse gave way to the wire, just as the wire would later give way to radio satellites and the internet. At a time when America was still defining itself, the Pony Express told a tale of bravery, sacrifice, and unity through hardship. Figures like Pony Bob Haslam and Buffalo. The image of a lone rider silhouetted against the sunset, thundering across the prairie with a leather mail pouch and a six-shooter at his side, captured the nation's heart. Speed and the unrelenting frontier spirit. Hollywood dime novels and school textbooks turned the Express into a legend. Regardless of whether he rode for the Express or not, Bill Cody became a frontier celebrity. His Wild West shows helped to solidify the image of the fearless teenage courier in the minds of millions of people worldwide, and the Express came to represent all that Americans wanted to believe about their pioneer. The U.S. Postal Service has released Pony Express stamps to commemorate the short but daring venture that brought the country together. But the story endures for a deeper reason. Previous monuments soon followed, and statues of galloping riders now stand in cities across the old trail from St. Joseph to Sacramento. Highways and bike paths trace the original route. Museum exhibits and historical tours also preserve the memory. The Pony Express tells us that speed once came not from satellites, but from sheer determination and a willingness to ride through snow, desert, and darkness with nothing but a horse and a dream. In our age of instant messages and global networks, it's easy to forget just how difficult communication once was. It reminds us of a time in history when human endurance raced neck and neck with nature's obstacles, when communication meant risk and connection required courage. The Pony Express is a monument to people who, using sheer grit and a racing heartbeat, rather than fiber optics or electricity, overcame impossibly long distances. Its legend endures not because it survived, but rather because it outran the impossible for a fleeting and brilliant moment. The earliest known beer was made in a clay pot in the middle of a Sumerian village thousands of years ago. This was before Rome rose or the pyramids were built. The Sumerians in particular were making beer in simple yet sacred ways, and they weren't just drinking it, they were worshipping it. It is no coincidence that the oldest known recipe for beer, found on clay tablets dating back to approximately 1800 BCE, is not for bread or soup, but rather for beer. The hymn to Ninkasi honors the goddess of beer while also providing VAS brewing instructions. In Sumerian society, beer was not just a casual beverage. It was a staple food, a form of currency, a religious offering, and a symbol of civilization. Invoking the presence of Ninkasi through beer brewing was a practical and lyrical way to honor her. And she was not a mere divinity. Sumerians would bake a special bread called bapia, made of barley, and often mixed with honey or dates. This bread was then crumbled into jars of water and left to ferment. Naturally, the result wasn't anything like modern beer. It was thick, cloudy, and low in alcohol, more like a nutritious GRL, and it was essential to daily life. Water in the ancient world was often contaminated, but beer, thanks to its fermentation process, was safer. It was rich in calories and nutrients, and it became a vital part of the diet for laborers, priests and royalty alike. Workers on temple projects or irrigation ditches were frequently paid in beer rations, which could amount to several liters a day. Socially, beer was a communal experience rather than drinking from mugs. People often gathered around large ceramic vessels and drank through long reed straws, filtering out the sediment. It wasn't just about getting drunk, it was about bonding, surviving, and even honoring the gods. In many ways, beer helped define what it meant to be Sumerian. It was embedded in rituals, law codes. If the Sumerians gave beer its spiritual origins, the Egyptians industrialized it. And by the time the Old Kingdom was emerging along the Nile, beer had evolved into more than just a sacred beverage. It was a pillar of Egyptian society, woven into everything from daily meals to divine offerings and funeral rites. Agriculture and economics were liquid civilization, both a daily necessity and a sacred act. And it set the stage for brewing cultures throughout the ancient world, from the banks of the Tigris to the shores of the Nile. At massive temples and palace complexes, Egyptian beer was made on a scale that eclipsed previous techniques. Large breweries were a part of the state economy. In fact, religious organizations frequently oversaw the production of beer. Beer was widely used in ceremonies honoring deities like Hathor, the goddess of music, fertility, and joy. who was often linked to intoxication. The Egyptians believed that beer was a gift from Osiris, the god of agriculture and fertility. In reality, the brewing process was similar to that of the Sumerians, but it had changed in terms of both technique and scale. Beer wasn't just for the living. Tombs were also filled with jars of beer for the afterlife, along with loaves of bread and meat beer. This was because beer was so necessary that no respectable journey to the next world could be imagined without it. Bread made from wheat or barley was partially baked, crumbled into large vats, and mixed with water, dates, or honey for sweetness. The mixture was then allowed to ferment in ceramic jars, producing a thick, unfiltered, and incredibly nutritious beverage that was occasionally eaten with a spoon rather than sipped. Beer's spiritual significance is highlighted by recipes for the dead, lists of beer offerings to the gods, and murals depicting the brewing process. The workers who built the pyramids were paid laborers, not slaves, and part of their daily rations included beer, sometimes up to 4 liters per day. One archaeologist even dubbed it the ancient Egyptian energy drink. The state maintained strict control over production and distribution, levied taxes on beer, and regulated its quality. Women, particularly priestesses and temple workers, were frequently involved in beer brewing, further solidifying its connection to both sacred power and domestic life. In other words, beer was not a side note, it was essential. It nourished the people, pleased the gods, filled the tombs, and, like the Nile, it permeated every aspect of Egyptian life across ancient civilizations. Beer was more than just a beverage. It was a form of heavenly communion, and its foamy presence was welcomed into festivals, temples, and funerals. In Sumer, making beer was a way to engage with the spiritual realm, and drinking it was a way to partake in something more than mere sustenance. The goddess Nikarasi represented this connection. Fermentation was not viewed as a chemical process, but rather as a mystical transformation, a gift from the gods that transformed ordinary grain into sacred liquid. Her hymn served as both a prayer and a guide for sacred brewing rituals. Before fermenting started, chants were probably used to invoke her presence, and it's possible that the finished beer was given to priests as part of temple offerings, and even poured out in libations to the gods themselves. In Egypt, the spiritual use of beer was even more deeply ingrained in the religious fabric. During the annual festival of drunkenness, worshippers celebrated the myth of Sekhmet, the lion-headed goddess of destruction, who was tricked into drinking beer dyed red to resemble blood. As a result, her bloodlust was subdued and humanity was spared. It's a compelling story of how beer was literally seen as a force that could tame divine wrath. Priests and priestesses were involved in the brewing process, and many religious texts mention specific ritual brews meant for ceremonies. Privileges also included beer, which was thought to help the soul travel to the afterlife. Some tomb inscriptions specifically identify specific beer offerings to be made outdoors, along with prayers and hymns. Even in later cultures like the Hebrews or the Hittites, beer retained spiritual undertones while wine gained favor in elite rituals. Beer remained tied to fertility, the earth, and the working class, maintaining its ancient role as a sacred and grounding force in the ancient world. In the ancient world, drinking beer wasn't just about quenching thirst, it was about aligning yourself with cosmic rhythms, with God's nature, and the cycle of life and death. Outside the temples, seasonal festivals frequently involved large-scale communal drinking. These were not casual parties. They were acts of connection between the human and divine realms. Some historians and archaeologists now argue that the desire to brew beer was one of the driving forces behind early agriculture and settlement. While grain was certainly grown for bread, the possibility that humans began cultivating cereals in part to make beer is gaining increasing scholarly support. If true, Beer isn't just a byproduct of civilization. It's one of its founding pillars in ancient Mesopotamia, where organized farming first took root. Evidence suggests that barley, one of the earliest domesticated grains, was prized not just for food, but for its fermentable sugars. Once harvested barley could be stored ground and used in both bread and beer production. And unlike water, which was often polluted, fermented beer was safe to drink and could be stored longer. This made it essential. For early communities, especially in arid or semi-arid regions, where water supplies were unreliable, beer production also necessitated a level of social organization. Brewing required tools, storage vessels, controlled temperatures, and precise timing. In an era without thermometers or yeast packets, this promoted the division of labor, technological innovation, and even early science. As evidenced by clay tablets, ancient brewers were able to replicate fermentation processes consistently, which was no small accomplishment in cities like Uruk and Babylon, where breweries were incorporated into state and temple economies. Because beer was closely linked to both the economy and religion, its production was closely monitored and regulated, which meant that brewing contributed to the rise of bureaucracy by distributing beer rations to workers, soldiers, and bureaucrats. Additionally, taxes could be levied in either grain or beer. Additionally, beer played a key role in the development of trade networks, as areas with excess grain and brewing expertise traded beer ingredients and brewing equipment with nearby cultures. In short, beer helped humans settle, organize, and thrive. It fueled workers, connected cities, supported rituals, and justified grain cultivation. The frothy beverage was much more than just a treat. It was liquid infrastructure that built the foundation of the ancient world, sip by sip, long before breweries were industrialized or recipes were written down. Pottery jars filled with fermented beverages have been found in Levantine and Egyptian trade sites, suggesting that beer was a commodity worth transporting. Brewing was not a male-dominated profession, but a household art practiced almost exclusively by females, and far from being a humble kitchen chore, brewing was seen as a sacred and skilled craft passed from mother to daughter, like an heirloom. Recipe in Sumerian society, beer was so entwined with femininity that even the goddess of brewing, Ninkasi, was female. This wasn't symbolic, it reflected the reality that Sumerian women were the principal brewers in both domestic and temple contexts. Brewing and baking were often done side by side, and in the early days both involved fermentation. While men oversaw politics and trade, women made the food and drink that sustained the household and society. In Egypt, women continued to dominate brewing, especially in the home. Beer was brewed in clay vessels using lightly baked loaves of grain, water, and flavorings. The process was labor-intensive, but routine. Many women brewed daily or weekly, not just for family consumption, but for sale or trade in local markets in wealthier households. Small-scale breweries were run by female employees, or servants. Women were significantly involved in brewing for temples and rituals, and their central involvement in this important aspect of life is highlighted by the frequent depictions of them brewing, filtering, and storing beer in tomb paintings and hieroglyphics. Priestesses and temple employees frequently oversaw sacred batches, intended for offerings or religious festivals in some areas. These women weren't just cooks, they were custodians of divine tradition. Over time, as societies became more stratified, and beer became commercialized, men took control of public brewing, but in the early history of beer, women held the reins. They developed the methods, managed the ingredients, and protected the knowledge. Interestingly, remnants of this tradition persisted into the medieval era in Europe. Many of the early brewers were alewives, women who made and sold ale from their homes. Some wore tall hats to be seen in the marketplace, a detail that would later be twisted into the stereotypical image of a witch. In the ancient world, a woman with a brew pot wasn't suspicious. She was respected and fed both gods and mortals. One jar at a time, bubbling, while each culture had its own variations. The fundamentals of ancient brewing were surprisingly consistent: grain, water, fermentation, time, and observation. However, the details are where the story becomes fascinating. Ancient brewing was not just luck and magic, it was a craft that was developed over generations by combining observation, experimentation, and environmental knowledge. Although wheat was also widely used, particularly in Egypt, barley was the main grain utilized throughout much of the ancient world. These grains were selected not only because they were readily available, but also because they naturally contained the sugars and enzymes needed for fermentation. In both Mesopotamian and Egyptian traditions, grains were typically partially malted, soaked in water, and allowed to germinate slightly before being either ground into mash or baked into loaves of bread specifically intended for brewing. These bread loaves, known as papia in Sumer, were crumbled into large ceramic vats filled with water. The mixture was stirred occasionally, and then left to ferment naturally. No one knew what yeast was, but they knew that it worked, and that certain vessels made better beer, probably because they contained leftover yeast colonies to flavor or sweeten the beer brewers added dates, honey, spices, or herbs. Egyptian beer in particular was often thick and sweet, almost like a liquid porridge. Filtering was optional. Some versions were consumed with straws to avoid sediment, others were so nutritious that beer was considered a meal in itself, especially for laborers, and the poor temperature played a key role in hot climates like Egypt and Mesopotamia. Brewers timed their work carefully and used cool storage, pits or shaded courtyards to control the environment. In some cases beer was aged in sealed clay jars, while in others it was meant to be consumed. Fresh brewing tools included large clay vessels, wooden paddles, woven sieves, and sometimes stone hearths for heating. Everything was made by hand, and every batch was slightly different, but the knowledge was passed down orally or ritually preserved through repetition, song and prayer, like the hymn to Ninkasi. Far from primitive ancient brewing techniques were sophisticated adaptations to local climates, grains, and cultural preferences. They reflect not just culinary skill, but an intimate relationship with nature, time, and transformation. A kind of alchemy, where grain and water became a sacred social elixir, as beer became central to daily life. Its role expanded far beyond the household or temple. In many ancient civilizations, beer was not just a beverage. It was currency, commodity, and economic engine. From workers' wages to state taxes, beer played a significant role in the ration system, which was a staple of ancient Mesopotamian trade. Workers, including farmers, builders, and even scribes, were paid daily portions of beer, though the quantity and quality varied by rank, with higher officials receiving more refined beer, and laborers receiving thicker, coarser types. Thousands of old receipts document beer trades, and comprehensive, uneven tablets indicate these allocations, demonstrating that alcohol was just as significant to the economic environment as grain or silver. Breweries, sometimes found on temples or estates, needed a small army of workers to produce beer, which turned into a professional occupation. These workers included grain collectors, millers, bakers, fermenters, and transporters. Some areas developed distinct styles and established local trade routes by specializing in beer production. The picture was similar in Egypt, where beer was produced on a massive scale in both urban and rural estates. Breweries were frequently attached to state granaries, and their output supported workers, soldiers, and temple activities. These beers were not bottled and shipped like they are today, but they could be transported in ceramic jars, sealed with wax or cloth. In hard times, Beer even became a bartering tool in place of scarce currency. Additionally, beer was used in long-distance trade. Barley-based beer remains have been discovered in clay vessels as far apart as the Levant. Cyprus and Nubia imply that wine will eventually rule aristocratic marketplaces and that fermented drinks were traded alongside luxury goods. Beer was still the preferred beverage of the populace and was used in all transactions, including handouts at temples and village markets. In the ancient world, beer was not only consumed, but also counted, traded, stored, and spent. It helped build pyramids, fund temples, and sustain empires. A mug of beer may have cost a few copper coins, but behind it stood a microcosm of civilization. Its portability and perishability made it a uniquely local economic product, but one of national importance. Its production supported farmers, artisans, merchants, and priests alike. As with food, clothing, and language, the strict social hierarchies of the time were reflected and reinforced by beer, while commoners drank hearty, thick brews to survive. The elites used beer as a status symbol, a ritual offering, and occasionally, even a political tool. Among the Sumerians and Odeons, workers were given daily rations of beer, which was dark, unfiltered, and dense, more stew than drink, but incredibly nourishing. Even though these were utilitarian beers designed to keep workers hydrated in hot, dry circumstances, there were still differences. Some tablets list at least 9 different types of beer, ranked by quality and purpose. The better varieties were typically reserved for scribes, priests, or administrators, demonstrating that beer was already being used to draw class lines in Egypt. The contrast was even more pronounced in Egypt, where the wealthy drank refined brews that were lighter, sweeter, and occasionally filtered, while the lower classes drank goblets of golden beer while sitting under palm fronds. Beer was an aesthetic pleasure as well as a source of nourishment. Daily beer offerings were given to pharaohs and their families, frequently, along with wine and bread. These beverages weren't just customs. They were symbols of power. Only the wealthy could hire specialized brewers, have access to the best ingredients, and have the time to enjoy beer for pleasure rather than as a calorie source. Additionally, beer was used for diplomatic and ceremonial purposes during feasts, treaties, or religious festivals. Offering premium beer indicated wealth and respect, rather than serving alcohol that might be interpreted as offensive. It's noteworthy to note that the brewing industry itself reflected this division in houses and towns. While beer was universal, its taste, texture, and meaning varied greatly depending on who you were. For some, it was daily fuel. For others, it was an expression of divinity, wealth, and refinement in every jar. Ancient beer carried not just flavor, but also a quiet signature of social status foaming at the rim. Even though thousands of years had passed since Sumerian priestesses chanted to Ninkasi or Egyptian workers sipped beer beneath the shadows of pyramids, traditionally, women or slaves brewed the family's supply. But in temples or elite households, professional brewers occasionally trained and salaried individuals handled production. Our recipes continue to carry on the tradition of historical brewing, cultural memory, and ritual economics, perhaps more than any other beverage. Beer ties us to the earliest manifestations of civilization. Many of the techniques we take for granted today, such as fermenting grain with wild yeast and flavoring it with herbs or fruit, were invented by brewers without the use of microscopes or thermometers. Instead, they relied on tradition, intuition, trial and error, and guidance from oral wisdom and spiritual reverence. These techniques laid the groundwork for what would later become scientific brewing. The antiquated view of beer is still present in Ethiopian and other cultural customs. There are still populations in rural Eastern Europe and Peru that brew beer in clay pots, frequently using family past traditions that have echoes of Sumerian and Egyptian cookery. As it was 5,000 years ago, brewing is more than just a pastime or business. It is a communal ritual, and the symbolic value of beer has persisted through festivals. Even the community pint at the pub preserves the same spirit as the ancient Sumerian clay pitcher shared by reed straws. Beer continues to be a prominent offering at holidays and social events around the world, serving as a drink of celebration, connection, and identity. Beer as a means of fostering academic relationships using residue analysis. The study of ancient brewing has given rise to a burgeoning science called biogeology. The next time you raise a glass, remember that you're not just drinking a beverage, you're taking part in one of humanity's oldest and most universal rituals. This legacy has been brewed over millennia and is still fermenting in every corner of the world. Scientists have successfully recreated ancient beer recipes, brewed them, and even sold them commercially. Experimental archaeology projects have successfully brewed beer from ancient Egyptian tomb recipes, giving modern people a literal taste of history. Perhaps most importantly, ancient beer serves as a reminder that civilization wasn't just built on conquest, stone, or steel. It was also built in kitchens and breweries by common people who transformed grain and water into sustenance, economy, and culture.